you all for coming. I'm Christopher Kohan, the president of the board of the Victor D'Amico Institute of Art, the Art Barge. And this is our first in a series of Artists Speak, but in a long series. Started back in 1983, 83, 84 by Howard Kanovitz, a great friend, trustee, and a painter who lived here on Cranberry Hole Road. We wanted artists to educate the public as to how and why they make their artwork and just give a platform for the artist to get into the studio and speak. And in 1985, in those series with Alfred Leslie, Richard Bosman, Miriam Shapiro, David spoke then. And so it's a really great honor to have him back after these years and to hear what he has to say, but especially so, I was so impressed when I found out that he had written the book. And I was so inspired many, many years ago by Alfred Barr, the first director of the first director of the Museum of Modern Art, who had hired Victor to explain modern art, wrote this book called What is Modern Painting, way back in '43, and it's been revised ever since, up until I think the beginning of the '90s. And he talked about the collection at the museum, the paintings, and what are we looking at as modern art? But David, and little booklet, but David far exceeds what Alfred had written about contemporary painting and artwork. And I think it's so important for us nowadays to have contemporary individuals explain what we are doing, and having an artist of David's renowned background also then put word to paper, not only paint to canvas, but word to paper, I think is equally important. So it's a double honor to have him here this year.
Oh. Dagmar thinks there's something. Hey, Dag, it's okay. Place. Dagmar, place. She thinks you're clapping for her. No. Dag, place. Place. That's right. Okay, stay. He's not used to blogs, I guess. So, well, thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Incredible day for it, actually.
That's right. Missing the storms.
It cleared up.
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering what it would be like to be here a couple of days ago, but then
it's always good.
yeah.
Even in a storm, it's almost better. The sunshine and the blue water just makes it too nice.
Okay.
It brings in the flies.
Yeah. So anyway, I really came today not so much to talk about my own work. I don't have any slides or anything like that, but to talking about art, which is a kind of a funny subject. It feels sort of once removed, but in my experience, most artists, and I use the word painter as a shorthand for any visual artist. Obviously, there's a lot more in the art world than painting, but I use painting as a convenient shorthand. The painters that I know are all pretty good talkers. They all have very interesting ideas and sometimes very singular ways of expressing those ideas, a kind of very personal use of language. But it seldom gets recorded. I mean, sometimes in interviews, but in interviews when someone has a tape recorder on, the language sometimes comes out a little bit stilted. But the way artists talk among themselves when no one else is listening, when there's no journalist or tape recorder, is very distinct, and in my experience, different from the way journalists talk about art or the way art historians or critics talk about art. And it stands to reason everyone has different purposes when they talk about art. Journalists, for the most part, are concerned with the social milieu in which artists operate and in which the art world sort of conducts itself. So they tend to focus on things like the market, the personnel, the museum personnel, and so on and so forth. So it's a social beat which is covered, very more like People magazine or something like that. And academic criticism is very specific, has to do with referencing theories usually imported from other disciplines, from whether it's semiology or Freudian psychoanalysis or Lacanian psychoanalysis. The academic criticism tends to focus more on the theoretical kind of overview and then finds individual examples of artists to slot into those theories as illustrations. But the way artists talk about art is very pragmatic by contrast. It has more to do with what works or what doesn't work, and if something's not working, what's wrong with it. So it's more, in my experience, again, your experience might be different, it's more focused on the how and not so much on the what. Journalistic criticism is focused on the what. What is it a painting of? What is it a picture of? Is it someone photographs the gay and lesbian community in San Francisco, or someone makes a painting of African tribal society? You know what I mean? It's or it's so-called non-objective. It's abstract. It's focused on the what it's a picture of, or what is being depicted, what is being represented. It has to do with the representational nature of art. But for artists, that's a given. The representational part is almost an aside. What interests artists is how it's done, because it is in the how which contains the artist's personality or their idiosyncratic handwriting, as it were. I mean, it's a simple experiment you can do with a Polaroid camera. If we passed around, well, they don't even have Polaroid cameras anymore, but anyway, the image still works. If you passed around a camera in this room and asked everybody to photograph the dog, there's one subject, there's one what. The what is the dog. But everyone would take a slightly different or radically different or completely different approach to representing that what, and that it is the how that is the real substance of art, the real thing which separates, that painting of a whatever and that painting of whatever. So, weirdly enough, the academic criticism, and certainly journalistic criticism, doesn't really concern itself with that. And I felt that it was time to bring that to everyone's attention, and also to talk about art in a way which avoids any kind of technical jargon, because it's not necessary to use certain terms borrowed from the French to make a point about why something's working and why something affects us in a certain way, or why something you might say is good, although that's a relative subjective term. And part of this goes back to my first years in New York in the art world. When I came from California, I was fortunate enough to know some somewhat older painters, people who'd been friends of my teachers at Cal Arts. And my first introduction to the way artists really talk to each other was at a bar on One University Place, one of Mickey Ruskin's famous bars, in which I heard David Diao talk to a painter of his generation, somewhat older painter, the following way. He said, this guy who's a very good painter, by the way, but I won't even tell you who he is, but he had a show up currently in New York at the time. This is 1976, probably. And David just looks at him, right at him and says, I'm really tired of the feeling of hot air I get every time I look at one of your paintings coming out from behind the painting. And I thought, whoa, that's kind of strong language. And the other guy just kind of he just immediately, went, I can't remember what he said to David. Oh yeah, what your work makes me think. And it wasn't just that they were insulting each other. It was that they were really trying to account for something which they deemed to be a deficiency in the other person's work. And it was interesting to watch them try to actually put their finger on it, like, what's wrong with your work? And I think it's kind of an exercise that, is actually worth doing. Then, fast forward many years later, decades later, I came across, it's actually quite famous, everyone knows it, who's had a certain kind of education, but I didn't know it. Something that Tolstoy allegedly said to Chekhov, and it's been sourced so many times, I tend to think it's actually true. Tolstoy was not a fan of Chekhov's plays. He said to him, as a dramatist, you're even worse than Shakespeare. Right? Which, if you think about it, it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Not only does he not like Chekhov, he doesn't even like Shakespeare. This is an example of something that doesn't really matter if it's true or not. What's interesting is how extreme it is and how succinctly it was expressed, which leads to one of the kind of principal tools of description, which is comparison. I mean, compared to someone else, maybe Chekhov wasn't so bad, but compared to, those comparisons of how we as people establish our bearings, get our bearings. So there's another inspiration for this collection, for the whole idea of starting the book. I'm a little bit in not a little bit, actually quite a lot, in the tradition of and in debt to another artist, another painter, writer, Fairfield Porter, who some of you might know, some of you might have known him personally. I never met him, but I'm sure most of you know his work. Fairfield lived in Southampton, commuted to the city regularly to file reviews for Arts Magazine, Art News, or other magazines. Sometimes The Nation. Dagmar, she's being bedeviled by flies or something. It's okay. All right. Place. We'll let her go. Anyway, so Fairfield Porter had a wonderful kind of brusque writing style, and apparently very much the same in conversation. He would, just say exactly as he saw it. But he had a wonderful formulation. He said that one's first impressions of a work of art, very much like one's first impressions on meeting a new person, are often very much to the point. And if you think about it, it's a very profound and kind of radical thing to say, that we all, as people, we all know within seconds or milliseconds when we meet someone if they're our kind of person or not. We could be wrong, we could change our mind, but by and large, the first impression is the one that stays with us and is actually very, gives us a lot of information. So you know right away if someone is, a bore or tedious or fascinating or elusive or mysterious, or someone's going to really do a number on you and you better be careful. You have so many impressions that come to you so quickly. And since art is made by people, why should art be any different? Why should art not also give off impressions which, if we're alert to them, we can register and process, more or less immediately. The problem is that connection somehow, somewhere along the line, from grade school to the present, has been severed, and we have to now kind of knit it back together. And what that means is we have to learn how to notice what it is we're noticing. So when you go to a museum with a group of earnest people, it doesn't matter. I would say children are different, but let's say anyone over the age of 16 or 18 anyway, without any special prompting or conditioning, if you go through a museum of contemporary art with a group of people and you ask them, what do you think this work is about? More or less, of course there are exceptions, more or less people will give you the very, very earnest answer, like, and they'll read the wall label. We know this is a work which references the artist's Celtic heritage or so on and so forth. But no one will tell you if it's any good or not. because of course, everyone's afraid to have that opinion. They don't feel like qualified to have that opinion. At a certain level, what else really matters? If it's doing something, does it really matter if it's referencing someone's Celtic heritage? I'm using that as a frivolous example, but it's a real example. There was a show at MoMA some years ago there on the theme of artists who were either from or were involved with or had a particular kind of heritage relationship to the Middle East. It was essentially a show of contemporary Iranian art, but it had to be couched in a much more inclusive globalist terms. And one of the odd things about the show was Mike Kelly was included. Mike Kelly from Detroit, a kind of Catholic boy from Detroit, was in the show of Middle Eastern art. Because Mike had perversely or devilishly or frivolously had a prayer rug woven for him in Afghanistan by Afghani weavers, in which he had substituted Kelly green for the traditional red background. It wasn't much of a work of art. It was pretty slight as Mike's work goes. But the wall label actually said, I said, what the hell is this thing doing here? The wall label said, Mike Kelly's referencing his Celtic heritage. And I thought to myself, no, he's not. He's just fucking with you. He's having a good time, having fun. So it's that, no, it's not, or no, it's not, it doesn't do that at all. It's not doing anything like that. You have to cultivate the kind of skepticism to not be bullied by the wall label vocabulary, which is, it's a very aggressive language. So, what are the principles of art criticism, of my writing? So anyway, I wrote this. The idea for the book was to write about art the way artists talk about art among themselves, and to sort of cut to the chase, as it were. Is this any good? If it is, what's it good at? And if it's not any good, what's the trouble? But there are very few negative examples in the book. It probably would have been interesting to have more, but since I'm not really a critic, I'm really a painter, and I have to make time for writing, and writing is very hard work, as everyone knows. It takes me a long time. I kind of resolved very early on, I was only going to write about things that I really, truly thought were terrific. Because otherwise it's just not worth the time. It's not worth my time to sort of hand out demerits to people. And, I know I don't want to be one of those New York Times critics that's sort of now rapping people on the knuckles with a ruler. I want to talk about things that really, I think, are really wonderful, and they're very much unlike what I do, which makes it more interesting to try to excavate why it gets to me, why I think it's good. However, there are a couple, 2 or 3 negative examples in the book, because without at least one negative example to throw the positive ones in relief, it's it doesn't really it needs a counterweight. I think the principle comes from Plato. You have to show the negative example to make the positive examples sort of come to life. So there are 1 or 2. The only really nasty one is about the sculptor Thomas Hausigo. Why did I pick on Thomas Hausigo? I don't know. There's so many candidates for the overblown and the overproduced, overpromoted. I could have picked someone else, but I didn't. It wasn't so much that his work is inflated in the market. That I really don't care about at all. I really try to avoid talking about that. But just the work itself gave off such a, I feel like David Diao talking, such a kind of feeling of hot air that it was, it just gave me an idea. So in order for me to write about something, I write about very, very specific people, very specific works. And it is by no means everyone whose work I think is great or interesting. But for me to write about something, I have to actually have a way into talking about it, and that is something I don't have any control over. So I was looking at Thomas Hausigo's work, and I met him. He's perfectly nice egomaniac. I mean, no worse than a lot of other people. But I was looking at his work, and I know a lot of people people I respect like it, so I was trying to see what it is. And the more I looked at it, the less I liked it. And then this image just occurred to me, just popped into my head, which I begin the essay in the following way. I'm going to just paraphrase it for you, I'm not going to read it. But there was an episode of The Sopranos, a show which I'm sure you all loved as much as I did, a late episode of The Sopranos where there's a mobster named John who's doing a life sentence in prison, but he's also dying of cancer. So he's in the prison hospital, and the diagnosis is grim. But the orderly in the prison hospital is another lifer, inmate, but on the outside was actually an oncologist. So it's this unlikely meeting place of the mobster and the former oncologist, and the doctor, former doctor, says, "Let me look at your X-rays. I don't trust these guys. I mean, look at the X-rays." And he gives the mobster John a much more positive prognosis. Turns out that he was wrong, but the mobster, he's in because he's a mobster, because he's killed people. He says to the doctor, "What are you doing here? I'm here because I'm me, but what are you here for?" He said, "Well, I shot my wife." And he said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, she was cheating on me, and I was spying on her, and I just had a gun with me, and I didn't mean to shoot her, but I shot her, and then I shot her lover too." And the mobster John is incredulous. I said, "Really? That was stupid. If you just shot the lover, you might have gotten off with manslaughter. You got out now, in 10 years or something." And he said, "Yeah, I know, it was really dumb, but then there's this was in the Plaza Hotel, and some security guys rushed in when they heard gunshots, and I took them out too. So now I'm in here." And John says, "Man, that was really dumb. Why didn't you, just like quit in your head?" And the doctor says, "I don't know. I just figured I was in so deep already. Only option was just keep on going. I thought if I just blast my way out of it." And that reminds me of Thomas Housego's work. So anyway, and then I start the really negative review. So, but basically, the book is full of praise for everyone. So I'm just gonna read you some very, very short, I promise, short little excerpts the book, so you get a sense of the language. Because I do have to say that what I'm really interested in doing, it sounds sort of pretentious or self-aggrandizing, but I don't care. What I'm really interested in doing is writing. I'm really trying to find a way to write, and like everyone knows that, especially for a first-time writer, they should write about what they know, and the only thing I really know about is art. So I'm using art as a way to write, but it's the writing that I'm interested in. I'm interested in trying to capture something in writing which is fragile and hard to elicit on the page without sort of tearing the wings off the butterfly, so to speak. So it's an exercise in, dare I say, creative writing, try to find the language which brings the thing to mind in a way which is useful. So again, these are just little snippets, but they give you a sense of what I'm talking about. They're not in any particular order. So on Frank Stella, an artist I'm sure you all know, who had his third career retrospective last year at the Whitney. Frank had his first MoMA retrospective in 1970 at age 33. A second one followed in 1989. Together, they formed the story of Genesis told in paint. After first stripping down painting to its essentials, so I have my glasses here, the curator, after first stripping painting down to its essentials, the creator then populated the world with every manner of flora and fauna. When the work finally reached a cul-de-sac of its own making, sometime before the beginning of the new century, it was like seeing a great champion of the ring, a little wobbly of knee, finally hit the canvas. As I walked through the exhibition a second and then a third time after what felt like miles of pure retinal engagement, the overwhelming realization could no longer be held at bay. This is decorative painting. Eccentricity for its own sake always ends up being decorative. It might seem a strange pairing, but Stella's closest philosophical kin is not so much Malevich as Art Nouveau, his closest stylistic relative, the Grand Kabuki. And not all of the artists in the book are contemporary. Here's one on, there's actually an essay on Piero della Francesca. Honest solidity of form on one hand, and weightless arabesques on the other. Piero's Hellenist-leaning presentational gravitas, combined as it is with the attention to light and shadow, makes his work feel alive in the moment. Light and air seem to move through it. On Sigmar Polka, I don't know if you all saw the Polka retrospective at MoMA a few years ago. Was it 5 years ago? With the death of Sigmar Polka in 2010, the miracle that was post-war German art feels like a narrative completed. Richter, Boslitz, Penck, and some Kiefer, as well as the younger Albert Olin, are all alive and well. But the deaths of the prophet-like Polka, the political activist Immendorf, and the charmed gadfly fuck-up Martin Kippenberger, a revelatory period in German painting came to a close. Polka's art is formally advanced, humanistic in a vaguely cynical way, and often hilarious. You can feel that he loves humanity so long as it doesn't impinge on his freedom of movement. You sometimes feel he took painting apart with a screwdriver, looked at the pieces, and got bored before he could put them back together. On Robert Gober. The elegant and elegiac sculptor Robert Gober is the poet of drains. Unlike the ready-made urinal by a certain Armut, Mr. Gober's drains and the sinks that would house them are lovingly, one wants to say achingly, crafted from wood, plaster, and paint. We were talking about Mike Kelly earlier. It's hard to love an artist whose primary emotional register is shame. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Mike Kelly managed during his lifetime to attract a big top full of cultish, fervent partisans that included disaffected intellectuals and Park Avenue matrons. The lecturers joined hands with the lectured to. On Jack Goldstein, do you all know his work? He was at a show at the Jewish Museum some years ago. Another artist no longer with us. Jack Goldstein, who is a fellow student of mine, Jack Goldstein is the kind of artist who thinks he has to be the prickliest cactus in the desert. His work is like walking through dried leaves on a chilly fall day. You keep your hands in your pockets, kicking leaves into the gutter, all the while hoping someone will see and feel sorry for you. The self-consciousness of the act doesn't necessarily diminish its poetry. And on Jeff Koons. If abstract painting expresses the idea, you are what you do, and pop art expresses the idea, you are what you like, then Koons's art says, you are what other people like. And there's a long essay in the book that's a review of MoMA's group painting show from a few years ago called Forever Now, which is a funny title. So this is the review of that show. A group show is like any party. There are the people you want to spend time with and the bores you can't wait to get away from. There are artists who repay our attention with interest and others who simply use it up. On art school, the art is mute, but we still want to talk. So those are some, gives you some flavor of the language of the book. You know, what I'm trying to establish in all of the pieces, and they all kind of reinforce this idea in different ways, is that the visual art has a syntax and a grammar like any language. It's a human language like any other, and as such, it can be syntactically understood. And that's a different idea than simply thinking of art as an accumulation of cultural signs. The way art is written about in the popular press, or in art form for that matter, is not that much different, is as a kind of cultural signage where if we understand what the references are, we somehow understand what the art is. Almost like the famous joke about joke telling, that you tell a joke by number. Everyone's heard the joke so many times they just say the number and everyone laughs. Number 11, it's a really great joke. If I feel personally, you might feel differently, that for art to be interesting, it really has to be more than a strategy, that for it to work in a big way, in a large way. And it's not really the case, I don't think, that artists, maybe some do, probably there are many who do, but the ones I think we care about, not so much. I don't think it's the case that artists decide what they're going to do as if they're choosing from a menu of Chinese food or something, one of those. It generally comes out of something more inner necessity, tempered through many years of experience, inflected by a very particular life history and narrative. But those things are all kind of forged together to produce this sort of syntactical individuality that I'm talking about. So that I think it does that process a disservice to just reduce it to cultural signs, although that is a component, but it can't be the only thing, otherwise there won't be any real longevity in the work. There's a phrase that Alex Katz uses, and Alex is probably the best verbal distiller of art that I know. He talks about art's inside energy. What is the inside energy that a work has that communicates itself to us? It's often very different from the thing which the journalist seizes on. And I think familiarity with that inside energy, or being able to recognize it or name it, is something that just comes with experience. Another great friend who also, unfortunately, is no longer with us, Henry Geldzaler, who probably some of you knew or certainly know about. Henry wrote a wonderful book just before he died, essentially paralleling my book, although I didn't really realize it at the time. Henry talks about the development of taste, which is a term that is considered to be something that doesn't exist. You can't really talk about taste in certain academic circles. But on a certain level, what else do we have? What we have is, taste is a name for our particular experience and who we are. But Henry was trying to describe the process by which a curator, or any art person, develops their taste. How do you get from liking everything, more or less, to liking the things that are better, and then from that being able to make distinctions between the better and the very good and the best, if that interests you. If it doesn't interest you, then you don't have to bother with it. But one of the objections which is often raised is that, well, only people of a certain class have the means to collect art and live with it and so on and so forth, and be able to familiarize themselves with it on that level. And Henry said, no, not at all. Certainly not if you're struggling to survive, but he said, if a good example was he used his own situation. My dog, there she's under the chair. Isn't that nice? Henry said when he was in college, he didn't come from a wealthy family at all. He and his roommates used to go to the flea market, and they would buy a vase, sometimes for $0.25, sometimes for $1.25. They'd take the vase back to the dorm, and they'd look at it until they got bored with it. And then they'd pool their money, and they'd go to the flea market again, and they'd buy a better vase. They'd look at that for a few weeks until they got bored with it, and they would trade these things among themselves. And the point was, little by little, through simply paying attention you begin to hone your reactions to things and begin to be much more specific about the formal properties that something has and whether something has approached those formal questions with some sort of originality or authority or something that simply elevates it over something else. It's purely a matter of practice and experience, which I kind of also believe is true. Information helps. Knowing a little bit of art history helps, but art history doesn't actually give you taste. It gives you information. There's a wonderful story, which I also believe to be true, that Balanchine used to tell, that when he first was hired by Diaghilev in, I think it was 1926, to be the new choreographer for the Ballet Russe, all that Balanchine knew was music and dance. He was also a pianist, but he had been deposited at the Mariinsky Theater by his mother when he was 8 years old, and had spent his entire life in the ballet and knew nothing about anything outside the world of the Mariinsky Theater. He was a genius choreographer already at age 26, but didn't know much else. So Diaghilev said, "Oh, my dear boy, you really must develop some taste," because apparently Balanchine liked really kitschy paintings. He didn't know any better. So they were in Venice, because that's where Diaghilev lived. And every day he would put Balanchine in front of one painting at the Accademia, probably a Tintoretto or a Titian, and say, you stay here until I come for you. You don't move. And he would come from 8 hours later. And Balanchine would have to look at that single painting for the whole day. And he said at the end of the summer, he had developed some taste. And he actually knew a good picture from a lesser picture. So it worked. It's kind of a brutal way to do it. So the inside energy of a work of art is something which, although is, I think, available to anyone who is curious and sensitized, I do believe that art is for everyone if everyone's interested. Not that it needs to be for everyone, but there's nothing privileged about it. It is really something that anyone can participate in. But the way to connect to that inside energy is not always obvious, and that takes practice. There's an analogy which I find useful that in the world of literature, that Milan Kundera, who I'm sure you all know his work, famous Czech writer, is he first came to our attention in the West in a series edited by Philip Roth called The Other Europe, in which he was really presented to the West as this quintessentially Czech writer, very much the heir to Franz Kafka, the other Czech writer everyone knows. So Kundera says, no. I have no interest in Kafka whatsoever. Kafka is not my guy at all. And I actually resent being called a Czech writer. I live in Paris, and I have no interest in Czech literature. So I consider my influences to be more the Americans. I'm much more influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, for example, and also the French 19th century realists, Balzac and so forth. So if you want to look for my family tree, my lineage, don't pigeonhole me as someone who just happens to be from Czechoslovakia, which I thought was very, very interesting. But what is our history really, except the study of genealogy? What something begets something else, and something is a current that seemingly ends here in this sandbar, miraculously was kind of resurrected, in another continent, let's say, decades later. Those interior linkages and lineages takes a bit of practice to ferret out. But I think that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book, is to show as one small example with Frank Stella, to show the stylistic and sensibility linkages which help to illuminate the thing in the present tense. I mean, Frank would hate being compared to Art Nouveau, but you know, sometimes we don't even know ourselves who our stylistic confreres really are. What are the other themes in the book? Well, people ask me, who did you read to use as a model for how to write about art? And I have to say, it's a little bit. That's not arrogant. It's just what it is. That very few contemporary art writers present a model for what I think of as useful art writing, and I think for any kind of descriptive writing, I would recommend to look at sports writing. And I spent a lot of time reading Red Smith, for example, who's was, while he was alive, was widely considered to be the dean of American sports writers. And Red Smith really wrote like Cicero. He just wrote with the most impeccable Latinate phrases. He had tremendous classical education behind him. It just so happened that sports was his subject. Sports was what he cared about. But the writing as writing is something that compares favorably to any kind of classical, formal oratory. And yeah, and at the same time, he had something that classical writers didn't have. He had the colloquial language at his disposal, and the language of the popular slang and the way people talk about sports in all kinds of colorful, shorthanded terms. So he was able to combine those two things together. And if I had to cite one single, I mean, there are many, many, many influences on my writing, but the one single one, I would single out Red Smith. Another style, in a way the opposite style, but also a big influence, is the drama critic Ken Tynan, who was drama critic for the New Yorker in the 60s and 70s. I think he died in 79. And I could never write like Ken Tynan. He was a truly gifted writer. But he gives anyone who cares about writing courage to follow their opinions. He was extremely opinionated, often to the anguish of the people he was writing about. But it was always for a higher purpose. There was a sense of, this is for the good of the art form, not necessarily for the good of each individual practitioner. So those are my guiding principles. What is it that, if I just sum it up into one kind of set of instructions, I'd say, what is it that you find yourself thinking about when you're looking at something, which is often very distinct from what you know you're supposed to be thinking about? So this is back to the wall label theme. The wall label tells us what the curator, why the curator thinks this thing is important to be included or to be considered. And it's fine, in that it might be useful or helpful or interesting, but it doesn't really have much to do with whether the thing holds our attention or not. So if the thing holds our attention, it's probably for other reasons, and the information that's contained in the wall label, while not being irrelevant exactly, will just sort of fade in importance. So what is it that you really find yourself noticing when you look at something? And it could be something negative. It could be, I was teaching a class I was in LA, and someone asked me to sit in on a kind of a year-end review at USC grad school. People were presenting their sort of final projects for the MFA, and the students were meant to critique each other's work, and you've all kind of had that experience of the group critique. where two things happen. One is people are very, very polite, and they give everybody a wide berth and say, yes, this is the most interesting piece of typed paper that we've ever seen in this room. Or they give each other a really hard time and say, you have no cultural right to use a typewriter like that. That typewriters were invented by these other people and not your people, you know. So it's one or the other. So I would always say, wait a minute, doesn't anybody just find themselves bored by this thing we're looking at, this, you know, whatever, this glasses case? And then people would say, yeah, it's kind of boring. I didn't know we could say that. So, but if you can't say what it is you're actually really, really feeling, how can you have a, you know, honest dialogue, or even honest with yourself dialogue about what the work is? And if you can't do that, how can you get to the next place in your own work? Because getting to that place in your own work requires ruthless self-criticism and just ruthless honesty with oneself. Did I do this thing which I thought I was doing, or did I not? You can't always tell, which is one reason why we have situations like this where you have your peers react to it. But that first impression, back to the Faithful Porter quote, or back to the barroom insult, the David Dial story from the first that I opened up with, that's the real stuff. That's the real stuff of learning to distinguish the real from the pretend, or the fully arrived at from the on its way, still on its way. Not that there's anything wrong with being on its way. But the first step is just the kind of brutal honesty. Like, what is this thing I'm looking at? And what does it make me feel? What is it doing? And if it's not doing much, just, it's fine to say that. So maybe now turn over to some questions. Yes, Ron?
They're very good or think are great and actually not like them?
Oh, sure, I think so. I mean, well, there's different kinds. I mean, like is one of those words that it's only 4 letters, but it reverberates in all kinds of directions, all kinds of ways. It means a lot of different things. Let's say, I mean, it's different if you're an artist, or maybe not. Maybe it's just anyone can have this experience. One meaning of the word like is it useful to me personally? Is there something that I can really hang my hat on in this work? And there are many works, I mean, as an artist, I think of someone did a really good job, and they're doing that thing that they're doing at a very high level. I just don't personally care about it very much. I'm not sure that thing needed doing, but if it needed doing, they're doing it, you know, as well as it could be done. So it's, you know, it's I guess one way of saying it, Ron, is that we want to take art on its own terms. We want to look at art on its own terms, and not, I don't want to, and a lot of people, well, I think a lot of professional critics do this, I don't want to fault something for not being something that it's not trying to be, you know. So, and it's perfectly valid for someone to make something which has a very different set of aims or goals than I might have, but they're doing it wholeheartedly and throwing themselves into it, and with gusto and verve and, you know, and presence. Then, you know, bravo, hats off. I mean, I'm glad they did it. You know, so I don't have to do it. But maybe that's a better, you know, better like is maybe too porous a word. I mean, the world of contemporary art is really problematic because so much of it is wishful. It's engaged. It's kind of its very existence is a function of kind of wishful thinking. It can't all do what it's supposedly doing. it would be impossible. I mean, there are too many people doing it, there are too many people showing it, too many, festivals and fairs, and so it's just the law of averages. It's just not everyone even understands what the kind of format is. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe if people file through shows and they get out of it what they get out of it. But I guess maybe a better way of putting it is what do you connect with, and if it's sometimes surprising. I mean, I'm surprised myself at what I connect with sometimes. Sometimes it's not the thing which I went in to see, but it's the thing that might be the marginal thing, or the forgotten, the overlooked thing. I mean, we're always looking for that element of surprise. We love to be surprised by, sometimes. There's an artist. I'm embarrassed. I won't even tell you his name because it's embarrassing, because I was so wrong. But there's an essay about him in the book. I really did not warm up to this guy's work for years. I had kind of written it off without really thinking about it too much. I assumed it was a failed example of something it wasn't trying to be, instead of taking it on its own terms and trying to put myself inside of its thinking instead of imposing my own thinking on it. So years went by and I never really connected this person's work. And then he had a show in Chelsea. This is 15 years ago. And I was walking by. I'd been to the gallery next to it, and I was going to the gallery on the other side of it. I was going to skip his show. I said, I don't need this. And I thought to myself, you're walking right by, and you're not even going to go in and look. That's pretty churlish. So I couldn't excuse my behavior. I couldn't live with myself, even if I didn't like it. But you've got to at least go and look. And I went and looked, and I had a complete conversion. I had a complete, being struck down on the road to Damascus. I thought, this is great. What was wrong with me? I just hadn't looked at it in the right way. And the work had changed. He'd made some very essential, very large moves in his work, which allowed me to connect with it. But it was through the new work that I was able to also go back and connect with the work I had really dismissed. So one can be wrong, and what's that? Yeah, right. No. Well, it's funny, but I never told him just how little regard I had for the work formally, but he read the review and he said he thought it was the best thing that had been written about his work. So anyway, yeah, I mean, we can be wrong. We try to stay open, but I try not to be dogmatic about it. Any other questions? Yes.
As it relates to your comment on a thinking experience?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think quite a lot of academic criticism has kind of led us to that point of thinking that there's a big difference. In a way, feeling, has been denigrated or just downgraded, not denigrated, relative to thinking. That thinking is ever since Duchamp, ever since Duchamp decoupled retinal experience from thinking, it's been considered to be a superior endeavor. But in my own personal experience, I find it hard to distinguish the two. I find it hard to know where one stops, the other one begins. And in fact, recent studies in neurobiology and neurology and all the areas of brain science that pertain to this very question increasingly point to the possibility that there's actually no difference. There's no difference in terms of our neurological function between thinking and feeling. They're just different names for interconnected processes and activities. We, especially in the West, tend to have privileged one over the other, but they're actually like this. So what's the difference? Sure, of course, some work is just much more intellectually pitched, and other work is more viscerally expressed. But you need the thinking to connect to the visceral experience you're having, and you need the emotional impetus to follow a train of thinking. I mean, I find them just so interconnected. I'm not sure that it's useful to separate or even to sequence them, because they, one. I apparently never learned to swim. I always swam. I thought I knew how to swim, but I was giving my stepdaughter for a present swimming lessons. She's 12, and the teacher was so good. I said to her, "Do you think you could teach adults? Because my swimming is pretty rusty." And she said, "Sure, why not?" So I've been taking swimming lessons, and every single thing I've been doing is wrong. I mean, the kick is wrong, the stroke is wrong, the hand, I apparently never really learned. Every single thing is wrong. So what's my point? The point is, just today I had swimming lessons, so it's on my mind. The rhythm of left, right, that's thinking and feeling. You can't leave one hanging too long because you need the other one to come right behind it. So I think that's just, that's a kind of human dimensional experience. Yes?
I may be going out on a limb, but I felt it.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's great. I mean, you're obviously excellent at that work, and you were to be applauded. That's what I call the how, being the orchestrator in my particular aesthetic, is the how, and paying attention to the how will lead you to the what it's about. But it's not even necessarily the same thing, although you can't have one without the other. One is expressed through the other. I mean, I wouldn't even know right now what to say, how to answer the what it's about question. I think it can be answered, but it doesn't have to be answered all the time. What's that? It doesn't have to be answered. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it can. It can be. I mean, that's really kind of the central, profound question. What does something mean? How do you access something's meaning? And I think the variety of ways, the way you access meaning in any endeavor in life, having a conversation, sometimes it comes through years of familiarity, and sometimes it comes in a blinding flash. I just finished reading Walter Hobbs' memoir. Walter Hobbs was a legendary curator. He was, at age 31, was the director of the Pasadena Art Museum in the 60s in LA, and was the first curator of the Menil Museum in Houston. He made some of the great exhibitions of our time. He was very close to Bob Rauschenberg. He made 2 separate Rauschenberg retrospectives. And he and Bob, Walter and Bob, were very, very bonded and had a lot of similar qualities. They're both kind of wild men of the West. When Walter was born in LA, Rauschenberg was born in Texas, as you know, but they were very much iconoclasts and people who believed in their own kind of linguistic eccentricity. So there's a famous work by Rauschenberg called Monogram, the work with the goat. You all know that work. It's a long-haired Angora goat is sitting on a painting on the floor and it has a tire around its middle. It's actually at MoMA now. You go to see the Rauschenberg show that's up now, which is just fabulous. I highly recommend it. It's right there. You can see it. I don't remember this, but apparently Bob Hughes, who also loved Rauschenberg's work and was very close to Rauschenberg, wrote a review of that particular piece, an interpretation of that particular piece, according to Walter, said it was in Hughes's interpretation, it was about a kind of tortured sexuality, kind of Bob's homosexuality or whatnot. And Walter said, "Oh, that was nonsense." The piece was about, it was a self-portrait of Rauschenberg. That one place. Rauschenberg is very much identifies with animals. If you knew him, I knew him as well. He was a very animalistic person who identified with animals. He had a pet goat as a boy that he loved dearly, that his father shot and killed. And Bob never quite got over it. And this goat, beautiful, long-haired, kind of gaze-worthy goat was Bob's stand-in. And he's standing on a painting and looking out for the viewer to look at him. And Bob was a very, very good-looking man and understood that he was a good-looking man. So that's Walter's interpretation. Which one's correct? You can choose. But I tend to believe Walter more than I believe Bob Hughes. So that, which raises the question of narrativity in work. We tend to think that meaning is a narrative meaning, and it's often true. But again, it's not usually the narrative that is on the surface, or the narrative which a journalistic critic might latch onto. And to excavate that narrative requires some thinking and feeling. Yeah. Do we have time for one more question? Yes.
Has your taste changed?
I feel like it's changing all the time. It's reifying all the time, and it's also changing, morphing all the time. It changes all the time. I mean, there are things that I revered when I was young that now I feel like are kind of, they're okay, they're fine, they have their place. Things that I didn't really get before seem really pretty lively now. Certain things are constants, and what does that mean, taste change? It means if you accumulate more experiences, it also means that the culture changes, and one's taste is in part a reflection of cultural winds. I mean, we're all living in the world. It doesn't, and feeling that people's reputations vis-a-vis one's own taste move up and down doesn't mean that people are being demoted. It just means that it's the energy of that thing might be used up in the moment, and it'll still be there when you come back to it. Certain things look dated, and you never thought that would happen. I never thought Jasper Johns would look dated, but it's a long time ago. Those things were made a long time ago. So it would be odd if they didn't look a little bit dated in some ways, or somehow constrained or limited. I mean, if we didn't go beyond Jasper, what is there to be no progress, as someone said?
Are there certain things that have stayed the same?
Well, I think certain things which I always go to, certain 19th century paintings. I mean, enough time has elapsed that they are now just themselves. We're far enough from Manet that we don't think about Manet in society. We just think about him in, on this Olympian height. So whenever I'm in Paris, I always go see, speaking of Olympia, because it's the greatest painting in the world, and it never lets me down. It never doesn't seem like the greatest painting in the world. But it's probably because of the complexity and the execution, but it's no longer because of its contemporary narrative, which would have been, lasted from 1860 to whenever it lasted, 1920 or something. Now it's just pure art, it's all art. But everything in our time is always constantly changing, depending upon, the other influences. Yes, any more questions? We have one more. We're done. That was a good, yes, sorry.
If you had to write about Warhol, what would you say?
Oh, about Andy. Well, I've written about him a little bit. It's super complicated, very, very, very complex phenomena. There are many, many ways into his work, since he did so many different things, and he stands for so many different things to so many different people. But I would talk about his work really purely as a member of the New York School. He's a late flowering of New York School painting, in terms of scale, color, use of abstraction, use of image. And the other thing to say about Andy is that there will simply never be another one. I mean, all these people who are trying to be another Andy, they can give up. But not necessarily for the reasons people think, not because there could never be anyone that outrageous or that whatever. It's because of his particular training. The training Andy had, which can't be duplicated, because he worked as an illustrator, having to fill page 3 of the New York Times every single day for years. Those I Magnum shoe ads he drew, but they were always on page 3 of the Times. That training, I'm sure, was irreplaceable and contributed a lot to Andy's aesthetic. He understood presentational vocabulary and presentational aesthetics and point of purchase aesthetics in a way which few people in any century, in any era, have understood it. He understood it instinctively, and he understood it from a standpoint of his own personality. He understood it because he had years of daily schooling and practice in that. And no, it's not available to any artist today. I mean, you could pretend that you're designing an ad for page 3 of the Times, but no one's actually paying you to do it, so it's not the same experience. And that combined with his extreme identification with the heroic New York school, which seems like a very different, almost contradictory sensibility, is precisely the union of those two influences which produced Warhol's particular aesthetic. I mean, a lot of other components as well, having discovered the silk screen as a way of making a drawing/painting, but the sense of scale, color, unitary image, gesture, all those things come straight out of the New York school, but the silkscreen picture comes from the New York Times. And those two things had never been thought of in the same context before, and it was like lightning in a bottle, and it'll never happen again. Yeah. So that was great. Thank you very much.